The final type of intervention that we'll discuss in this course is punishment. Like extinction, punishment is a reactive intervention. When the target behavior occurs, you manipulate the consequences in some way. To start out, what is the definition of punishment? As with extinction, consider the procedure and the process. That is, what do you do and what effect does it have on behavior? The definition of punishment is the addition or removal of a stimulus contingent upon behavior, which results in a rapid decrease in future occurrence of that behavior. The addition of a stimulus is positive punishment, whereas the removal of a stimulus is negative punishment. A couple of types of negative punishment are response cost and timeout. There are a few ethical codes that behavior analysts must follow directly related to the use of punishment. Code 4.8 actually includes several guidelines. We must always recommend and attempt reinforcement procedures before we rely on punishment. We must include reinforcement procedures if we do end up using punishment. We must provide thorough training and supervision of anyone who is using punishment. And we must monitor the effectiveness of the punishment so that we can discontinue it if it's not working or fade it out when goals are met. Of course, that last point is true of any intervention. 4.9 further notes that we must recommend interventions that are as least restrictive as possible. Punishment is one type of intervention that tends to be restrictive, but keep in mind that other interventions can be restrictive too. For example, response blocking or restriction, or pharmaceuticals like sedatives. With all this in mind, when is it appropriate to use punishment? The authors of the assigned chapter note that punishment may be clinically indicated when function-based treatments do not produce acceptable outcomes, when the reinforcers maintaining problem behavior can't be identified or controlled, or to intervene upon very dangerous behavior that must be eliminated quickly. In all of these cases, though, remember that you should also still use reinforcement-based interventions like NCR and DRA. They just might not be function-based versions. If it comes down to needing to use punishment, then what type of punishment should you use? Every person's behavior is affected differently by different stimuli. There are some unconditioned punishers, like pain, that are aversive without training. However, even those can actually acquire reinforcing properties over time through pairing, and if they're delivered often, the individual's behavior can habituate to them. In the assigned reading, how is it recommended that you select a type of punishment? One major recommendation that is made is to, if at all possible, consider the function of the behavior. In the left column here, different types of punishment are noted. Along the top of the chart, different functions of behavior are noted. If behavior is maintained by attention, trying to use a verbal reprimand as punishment is probably not going to work, and indeed would be contraindicated. It is actually likely to reinforce the behavior. Similarly, if you attempt to restrain an individual when they engage in escape-maintained behavior, they would still escape from the current demand. This type of punishment would also again provide attention. Based on this chart, what functions of behavior could allow for appropriate use of timeout? For which functions of behavior would timeout not be appropriate? These graphs show the result of functional analyses, which may suggest specific types of punishment that should be selected or avoided. In the top left panel, the data are undifferentiated. The function of the behavior is not clear. Should reprimands and physical contact be used to punish the behavior? No. If it was an effective punisher, we would see a decrease in responding in the attention condition. It's not contraindicated, but it won't work very well. In the middle panel on the left, we again can't really determine the function of the behavior, but the rate of behavior is much lower in the attention condition. So, what would be a good type of punishment to use intervening upon this behavior? Verbal reprimands and potentially physical contact like response blocking or redirection. It successfully suppressed the behavior even in the functional analysis. Finally, in the bottom left panel, we see the rate of behavior is highest in the attention condition, and all other conditions overlap with the control. What is the function of this behavior, And what type of punishment should we definitely not use? The graphs on the right show a similar sequence, but with different results in the escape from demand condition. Which graph shows behavior that should be punished by timeout? The middle graph. In this case, removing the demand and turning away completely during the functional analysis actually suppressed rates of responding. This indicates that timeout would be an effective punisher. In the top graph, that consequence doesn't appear to have any effect at all, and in the bottom, it's contraindicated. The authors of the assigned chapter noted other ways to select punishers as well. Be sure to record those methods in your prep guide. Once we've decided that we need to use punishment and have selected a procedure, there are other steps we must take in order to help ensure that it is as immediately effective as possible. Let's talk through each point. First, an easy one. Should the punisher be delivered immediately following the target behavior or with a delay? Definitely immediately. Close temporal contiguity of consequences will always make them more effective. Will punishment be effective if the target behavior is also still being reinforced? For example, let's say the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement, but we also deliver a vocal reprimand each time it happens. Will this quickly suppress behavior? Not likely. The punishment would need to be much stronger than the reinforcement maintaining the behavior, and even then, the behavior would simply continue to occur in any context in which punishment wasn't being delivered. What schedule of punishment should be used? Just like we use an FR1 schedule of reinforcement to teach a new behavior, we want to use an FR1 schedule of punishment to eliminate the old behavior. This makes it as distinctly different from the replacement behavior as possible. This one is a little trickier for a couple of reasons. Do you think that you should start out with a more mild form of punishment and increase it over time if necessary? Or do you think you should start with a more intense form right away? I know that it sounds risky or intrusive, but in terms of pure effectiveness, you should start with the more intense punishment. If you build up gradually, you'll make habituation more likely. A higher magnitude punisher will be more likely to eliminate the behavior immediately. Think back to the methods of selecting punishers for guidelines on how to select an effective punisher that is nonetheless not overly intense. There's one other interesting point not brought up in the assigned reading. Lerman and Vorndrund reviewed this in their 2002 paper. The assigned article by Vollmer is actually a reaction to their article. If you've attempted to intervene upon a specific behavior in the past with a specific type of punishment, but did so with poor treatment integrity, trying that same intervention again in the future is much less likely to be effective. This is another point related to habituation, as well as experience with being able to eventually escape the punishment. Again, this answer isn't in the assigned reading, but what do you think you could do to address this problem? You could use a different type of punishment procedure and/or combine the procedure with differential reinforcement of an appropriate alternative behavior in order to tip the scales, so to speak. The effects of punishment do not necessarily last forever. If reinforcement is in some way still available for the behavior, and if antecedent stimuli occasion or evoke it, it will come right back into the individual's repertoire if the punishment procedure is no longer in place. So, what are some ways that we can help ensure that the behavior will be more permanently suppressed? Let's go through the relevant headings in the assigned reading. This point has been made a couple of times, but it's important. What other intervention should always be paired with punishment? Differential reinforcement. If you simply try to eliminate a behavior and there's nothing to take its place, it won't work very well at all. Once the appropriate alternative is established, as long as it's high in the response class hierarchy, the problem behavior shouldn't reemerge. If we have specific SDs in place whenever we use punishment, we may eventually be able to present those SD as a proactive intervention, even when we no longer want to actively punish the response. Think about how we can eventually fade schedules of reinforcement so that we use GCRs like tokens instead of having to deliver the terminal reinforcer contingent on every occurrence of the desired behavior. how can we do something similar with conditioned punishers? As long as we occasionally pair the conditioned punisher, like a verbal reprimand or response clause, with a more intense form of punishment, we can eventually decrease the use of that intense form. This is much less intrusive during maintenance. The authors of the assigned chapter again bring up the idea of habituation here. It's a great point. Do you think it would be more effective to use one intense and prolonged type of punishment, or cycle through a number of brief but effective punishers? The latter. This prevents long-term exposure to the stimuli, which will avoid habituation. In this section, the authors also note that it's important to select a procedure that will be implemented with good treatment integrity. Finally, programming for generalization. Do you think that you should evaluate the effects of punishment in one environment first before moving on to others, or implement punishment in all environments? The more environments, the better. This helps to prevent behavioral contrast, and with a greater variety of training environments, the change in behavior will be more likely to generalize to novel environments. The last topic of this module is the potential side effects of punishment. We're going to focus on just a few here as they pertain very directly to how you should plan your punishment intervention. First, the behavior of people using punishment is often negatively reinforced. Punishment quickly gets rid of behavior that they want to eliminate, so they're likely to use punishment again in the future. Why might this be a problem? Remember, we need to recommend and attempt reinforcement procedures first. We don't want to immediately default to punishment. Be cognizant of this and monitor your own behavior carefully. When training others to use punishment, bring up this topic and give them clear rationale for why reinforcement should always be tried out first. Since punishment is of course aversive, the client may simply begin to avoid the environment in which punishment is delivered. How could you address this concern? Do all that you can to ensure that punishment is delivered in all environments so that simply avoiding it isn't possible. In addition, continue to pair yourself with reinforcement, or whoever is delivering the punishment. Finally, there's a chance that punishment will suppress a lot of different behaviors, not just the one that you're trying to eliminate. Let's say that you want to punish cursing and the individual stops talking around you at all. How could you avoid this effect? You could state clear rules about the contingencies if your client has an advanced verbal repertoire, or you could prompt and explicitly reinforce appropriate behavior. For an intervention that sounds so basic on its surface, there are many variables that you must consider when developing and implementing punishment procedures. Always keep in mind our ethical codes and what is best for your client long term.